Thanks, Brian, for inviting me to this inaugural season here for this lab. I must confess I had some moments where I felt a bit like the time when Marcus Antony asked Caesar if he wanted to go for a stroll in the spring in Rome. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. I was thinking about this about the lab discussion. We'll sit around, read a text together, have a few comments, have a little discussion. They told me last week they had X number of people here, and that it was pretty serious. So I tried to get serious about this and read the book carefully and do some things about it. We posted a PDF, so maybe we'll have that. If not, I've put kind of an outline here. It's not a paper, it's an outline. Has some quotes on it, a few suggestions from me, and we'll see what happens as we go through it. Selections from a book that's 300-something pages long, etc. So I kind of boil it down to a few pages here that we can look at. And we have plenty of room for questions as we go along. All right, quickly, Paul Ricoeur died 4 years ago now already. Protestant philosopher. He taught all over the place: Strasbourg, Paris, at Sorbonne, Nanterre. Famously in Nanterre, he was the dean of the faculty in 67, 68, 57, I guess, and during the riots, and decided that it was time for him to leave French academia because they blamed him for a lot of the problems. He ended up in Chicago, followed Paul Tillich in the John Newveen Chair in Philosophical Theology, Chicago, and taught there one semester for a number of years. Wide-ranging philosopher, both within the philosophical tradition, but also very curious about all other sorts of things. So he was a natural to speak with and sit down with Jean-Pierre Changeux, I think. Changeux, for those who are interested in these sorts of things, got his PhD at the Pasteur Institute with Jacques Monod, and then did some postdocs at Berkeley and Columbia, and took over the chair at the Collège de France. Now, this is the reason why this is important is because the Collège de France was created by whichever, I forget which king it was, but as a kind of civic institution. So you'd be elected to it in the various disciplines, and your job, you teach somewhere else as well, but your job and the prestige of being elected to this position was that once a year you had to give a summary of in relatively layman language, of the current standing of the discipline. So in this case, neuropsychology. So that's how your job. So he started giving these lectures, looking at the big picture. And out of those lectures came his first famous book called Neuronal Man, where he gave a kind of overview of his thinking about cognitive psychology. And eventually he had this dialogue, inside of his dialogue with Ricoeur, Ce que nous fait penser, What Makes Us Think, which was published in 1998. So, enough background. In terms of these folks, what they thought about these things and how these things come out, we'll see as we go along. A big book, again, 300 pages, a lot of looping back and forth, intersections, dialogues go, things cross over. It wasn't as neat and tidy as some books can be. So I picked a few themes that will help us to get started, and again, hopefully leave some room for some questions later on. The big question, which started out the book, is what of conversation, dialogue, communication? Why is it that philosophers, peoples in the humanities, have such a difficulty communicating, dialoguing with, speaking with people in neurosciences, and so there's kind of experiment. Can one? It wasn't done with it so that it couldn't be done, but with the goodwill that perhaps something could come out of this conversation. But there were no ground rules for it except to try to communicate and translate. It's an important notion for Ricoeur, of translation between different ways of being in the world, and trying to figure out how does one translate the experience at the cognitive level into categories that are available to us, that we all experience. None of us, few of us are cognitive scientists. Yet we experience the world, we live in the world, we have all kinds of things that go on with us. And the question is, how do we translate what's going on in the cognitive sciences into language that can be related to our everyday experience of the world? So that was the interest here. So, first section. Epistemological, methodological. I start with Changeux because he gives an introduction of what he's up to, and then some leading headlines. I'm going to read some of these bits and pieces. Introduction. And these quotes, the page numbers are from the handout, if you have the PDF, if you have the PDF, but I'll try to transcribe as much as possible. So, Changeux started studying the allostericity regulation of enzymes in bacteria. Now, this is dangerous for me, but the allostericity sites in enzymes and things are sites that are not active in other parts of the enzyme, but they can take on properties, interact with other chemicals and things, and these interactions can affect how they operate. operate. So these sites that are not directly related to their actions can develop relationships or connections to other things such that it changes how they operate. And so he wrote a famous paper on that, got his PhD. So here's what he says. Okay, studied the allosteronic regulation of enzymes and led to the discovery that the brain, this we did later on, possessed, quote, molecules that are very similar to those bacterial switches, receptors of chemical substances known as neurotransmitters that assist communication between nerve cells. Our cerebral functions, from the most modest to the most elevated, are also rooted in physico-chemical nature by virtue of the fact that they are mediated by these molecular switches. So his first notion was that some of the insight that he developed, that how our neuronal system functions is affected not through a kind of singular line of things, right? X happens and Y happens, Z happens, but there are all kinds of influences that are not direct in that chain of activity that influence how our neurons can function in this broader landscape. So that's what he's looking into. So, epigenesis. The brain, quote, cannot be viewed as a strictly genetic machine. This is his critique of certain radically reductionistic accounts, where the brain functions in a kind of linear fashion, right? Some input, output, like a kind of simple model. He rejects that, and epigenesis has to do with these surrounding things that happen outside of the strict genetic code here. So it cannot be viewed as a strictly genetic machine. It incorporates, within a defined genetic envelope, peculiar to the species, a series of nested epigenetic imprints that are established by variation and selection. Another way of stating this hypothesis is to say that evolutionary or epigenetic competition inside the brain takes over from the merely biological or genetic evolution of the species and creates as a consequence organic links with the physical, social, and cultural environment. Now, again, briefly, the idea behind this is the following. We have certain structures that are produced through, driven by our genetic code, but how those structures develop is not simply genetic or linear, right? They develop according to certain variations, random variations, right, that occur through our interaction with the environment, but also through the interaction of our own brain development. I mean, certain, again, random events occur in the brain. Certain possibilities in our neurons and our structures arise naturally through a kind of some random changes. And then, given our random environment, they interact again, we say these multiplications of random events, such that our brains develop according to a basic genetic thrust, but they develop in ways that are not predictable from that genetic thrust because of all these factors that impinge upon it. And so our brain development cannot be strictly examined in this linear fashion, but requires the belief that our brains develop according to social, environmental events. Right? Now how? We're going to talk about modeling here. This modeling consists in devising the simplest plausible neural architecture that constitute a formal or artificial organism capable of carrying out a defined cognitive learning task. First point. This approach, quote, appeals only to known elementary components of the brain, for example, the molecular receptors or neurotransmitters. And two, it also only appeals to, quote, the minimal degree of complexity that a network of nerve cells capable of carrying out specifically human tasks must possess. So these are kind of the ground rules for his investigation, is we need to understand what is the minimal architecture that the brain has to have in order to do the kind of things that we people do. That's his assumption. That's sort of his baseline assumptions as a scientist. Some background. Now we go into this more specific learning or epistemological question. Is a neuronal theory of knowledge possible? Introduction. Here's a quote which gives you a flavor of his scientific way of thinking and the way he understands it. Again, being French, his understanding of the scientific situation is fundamentally irreligious, if not anti-religious. So as you'll see by this quote. Okay. Quote, can anything more exciting be imagined, he tells Ricoeur, than to try to reconstruct human life in a way that rejects teleology, that rejects anthropocentrism, that rejects all conceptions of the world that takes refuge in religious superstition, what Spinoza called the refuge of ignorance. So this is the excitement of his understanding of what he's up to. If we abandon that superstition, that obscurantism, if you like, we can do the following. We can now challenge the fact value, brain thought, which he prefers that expression, or mind-body, if you like, distinctions, and resist the challenges of this religious obscurantism. So we can solve a lot of long-standing philosophical, psychological problems if we restrict ourselves to these methodologies and these insights that he's developed through his research into the allosteronic regulation of enzymes, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's his background. Here's his understanding of the learning process. I'm going to sketch out his understanding of the learning process. First of all, this is terribly important, the brain selects. There's a lot of percolation going on, within this genetic envelope. Chemicals are moving around, neurons are firing, random changes are happening in the brain, which gives us a certain kind of cache, or a certain kind of set of resources, right, which can be used to encounter the world. But the world that it encounters is not prefigured by any kind of ideas, categories, etc., right? It encounters a sheer stimulus from the world, but how to organize that stimulation is not predetermined or cannot be traced from the outside in, but is prefigured from the inside out. Right? That's his first point, right? So there are not essences or realities that are meaningful in the world. The person, the child in this case, encounters the world that is fundamentally meaningless, is a blank tablet, if you were. In the old days of philosophy, we talked about the blank tablet being inside of us, and then the meanings would come into us. That's the Lockean kind of notion. But now the blank tablet is out there. This is sheer impact from the outside world, and the structuring comes, at least initially, fundamentally from the inside, by these possible ways of interacting that the neuronal net in our brains have set up. Point number one. Point number two, the child has this is his word, pre-representations. So we call these pre-representations. Guesses, ways of thinking about the world, strategies, if you will, unconscious, but sort of biochemical strategies. They are available through randomizing factors and from biological inheritance. Right? So again, we're all born with certain brain structures and certain neuronal capacities that are what it means to be human, certain physiological and possibilities, plus these randomizing factors that are each in our own, as we grow, as our brains develop, that happen. These are our inheritance and our situation, which gives us gives us a way of encountering the world from these sort of pre-representations. These are non-stabilized mental objects, fluctuating variations that, according to the hypothesis I, Jean proposing, are identified with spontaneous, transitory states of activity. So the child reaching out, doing stuff, just encountering this world with these raw pre-representations, with multiple and variable populations of neurons capable of random combinations. So these fluid potentialities encounter a world, and then we have what he calls the moment of truth. The child projects these pre-representations, and depending on the signal received from the external world, the initial pre-representations is stabilized or not. So either this initial groping at the world, so I think I can pick this up, I can, get a positive stimuli back, helps for these random combinations to be stabilized. It's important. They get stabilized through progressive interaction with the world. We try something out, we get response back. That response, this is where it gets technical for me, but that response has to do with these neurotransmitters, dopamine and things, pleasures, things that encourage and facilitate. Pleasure is an interesting idea, right? On the one hand, we think of pleasure in a kind of behaviorist sense, and that I'm encouraged by punishment and reward. But in this sense, it's more biochemical, right? Dopamine or these neurotransmitters, they produce pleasure, we know that, but they also facilitate biochemical reactions among the neurons. They're also neurotransmitters. So biologically, they are enhanced. When they're present, that enhances this connectivity, right? But because they're related to pleasure, we can also tie back into that old behavioral language of pleasure reinforcing behavior in that more typical sense, right? That if I drink this and it tastes okay, I'll drink it again. We can see that from a macroscopic view, if you like. But also the notion behind that is a biochemical process going on in which the pleasure that's getting released, these neurotransmitters get released, help those connections between neurons to bind, to be more stable, right? So we can account for the fact that pleasure encourages certain kinds of behavior and pain discourages kind of behavior at a biochemical level, right? So that's the connection. So our neuronal connections get stabilized by this interaction insofar as certain kinds of neurotransmitters that inhibit and some that disinhibit are produced, and those help the biochemical structure or the neural architecture to be stabilized. So a selection takes place, the representation, he calls it, the pertinent category is selected. All right. There you go. What we create here is a kind of verificationist principle, right? So he loves this because this is wonderful, because this shows a way that the brain can develop in a rational, if you like, or in a kind of realistic manner, right? Things that don't function produce disinhibitors. Our neural networks change. Those that are beneficial, that are positive, produce better disinhibiting neurotransmitters, which, or more of it, let's put it that way, which help the neuronal structure develop and lock in. So we can see that our organism is suited better or worse. And we can measure that. We can measure these things. We can watch children, see how they function. We can do brain scans and see how that's stabilized, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have this kind of scientific or biological account of how things work and how children grow, learn, et cetera, et cetera. So the good thing is here we have a realist, verificationist account of knowledge. We can say that someone learns something insofar as they function better in this regard. Rough outline. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's the rough outline. Ricoeur's response. So this is back and forth. I try to do this. It doesn't work perfectly, but his response. I'll give you a shorthand because the response tends to be similar. The first thing you notice, which is interesting, is that this account of human being, of how our brain works, a human being, is really cognitive in the sense of knowledge acquisition. So the human person is understood in the most basic level as acquirers of knowledge, right? In a very classically empirical or scientific manner. So the human person is understood to be a certain set of brain functions. Those brain functions are understood fundamentally to be acquiring knowledge in ways that are very suitable to how scientists, empirical scientists, think of it. Trial and error, testing on hypotheses. So this is a little snide remark, I suppose. But fascinatingly, the human brain, or the human person in terms of their fundamental brain architecture, resembles modern scientific method, right? And so this is a connection that Jean wants to make. He says it gets us religious folks and other folks, look, if we recognize how things really are in the human person, we discover that the scientific method that we've been putting against religious thinking and all that is in fact how we really are, right? Which gives us a kind of empirical support for the priority of science. Without moral judgments, without value judgments, but so Ricoeur just makes this note. He says it's interesting, and he also blames Socrates. It's like Socrates' also account. Isn't it surprising that Socrates' account of the human person, right, is very much similar to his belief of how the world works, namely we become better human beings by knowing more, and we know more by acquiring knowledge of the forms. Right? And so, by the way, that's how our soul is constructed. Our soul is constructed with the forms inside. So the point is, he says this is a bias that starts with Socrates, if not before that, right? The notion of the human person is fundamentally an acquirer of true beliefs, right? Important stuff, but he just makes it in passing. He notes that the human person, as Jean sees it in this evolutionary account of human biology and cognitive function, is a knowledge acquirer. And the fundamental task of being human is to test what we acquire against the reality principle, the world, and to get better at it, and to sort of fit better into the world as it is, right? And to manage ourselves better, which isn't that what scientists do. Isn't that what scientists do? They test the world for those realities, et cetera, et cetera. A side point, but an important point later on. We'll come back to it. This notion of a kind of prefiguring that the scientist finds in the human brain what they want to find in the human brain, namely a mechanism for adapting to the world as it is constituted empirically. Point number one. We'll come back to that. 2. Ricoeur says the problem, this is tricky with Ricoeur. He doesn't deny the value of this and the truthfulness of it as far as that goes. But there's a situation in which, by taking this approach, we reify the inner-outer conception of the human person. Right? That what Jean is articulating, if I can, is a model like this, right? We got stuff in here, we got stuff out here, and the question is, the problem is, how do we usefully, match these up, right? If we match them up well, we're doing well. If we match it up poorly, we're doing poorly. And so there's this inner-outer box. So the person becomes here, the world is here, but here, notice, this is fundamentally a third-person perspective, right? It's the human person that can be observed, right? And in one sense, the third-person perspective is more adequate. Because if you're stuck in here, this becomes a problem, right? If you're stuck in here trying to think about it, you get this world over here, which is a problem. How do I get from here to here? And how did this get, we have this problem, how do you get in and out? How do you get through the door, as it were? The scientist says, I know how it works. I can map it. I can set an experiment, right? Here's the outside world. Here's the brain chemistry. We can map the brain, and we can see what happens when they interact from this point of view, right? But only a scientist sees that, right? So this is understanding the human person from the third-person perspective of the scientist, such that the human person is fundamentally the brain, or an it? He, she, baby, but a third person. So we're all this, right? And we all function the same way, even if in particular circuit we don't. And so what Ricoeur says is that's fine. Of course we can do this. We can map the brain. We can have people do exercises. We can follow it. Of course we can understand the human person. in this picture? Of course we can. We do it. There's no doubting it. We can do this. But the question here, this is the point that goes through this whole piece for Ricoeur, is translation. Does this way of seeing the human person, right, this third-person perspective, can it capture, translate that other sense of ourselves that we have, which is as a subject in the first person? As a first-person perspective, right, I encounter the world not in and out, but as the world in which I inhabit, right? Where I have coffee that I'm going to drink, a lecture that I have to give. This is how I encounter the world first, right? And not a matter of being in and out, but as a world in which I'm always already engaged with the outside. And the inside, that doesn't make any sense here, right? I'm not trying to get something in and out, in and out. I'm trying to manipulate a situation in which I am part of the situation from my first-person perspective. This is my world that I have to deal with. And the question is, can this picture capture that first-person sense of the world, in which I have particular relationships and responsibilities, and which are always, so the first thing I experience is not a brain doing something, then react to the outside world. What I experience primordially is being in the world. I'm in a situation, right? That's primary, nothing below that, right? There's nothing below that situation as far as that goes. Giving a talk to you is my primordial experience right now. And I don't start thinking, the answer to that question, how that's going to work out, is by going to this third-person perspective. I don't say, oh, what am I supposed to do here? What's my relationship here to these folks out here? Oh, I need to take a third-person perspective, put you up here, some generic person up here, and a generic audience, and try to figure out what happens. I can do that. You can study lectures and how people operate. I can do a test, But that's not my concern. Right now, maybe they're going to do that later on, and they can look at this study, and they can do an experiment and try to figure out what I did, what I responded to. You can actually examine the audience and me and try to figure out how I responded to cues that you're giving me. You can do that. I could do that to myself, actually. Right? I could go take that tape and go look at it and learn something about it, but I would be dealing with myself in a different way than I am dealing with it right now, where I'm in the middle of it. Right? So Ricoeur's first point is, can this theory account for this experience? Now, what's interesting about this is I can describe that experience to you that I'm having now. I can tell you about how it feels for me and what things are like for me right now, right? And I can give you a description of this first-person perspective that I'm having now giving the lecture. I could then go back and do it from the third-person perspective and talk about that, how it looked on the outside, right? The question is translation. How do these things translate? How does my first-person perspective relate to that third-person perspective that somebody else or I could take towards this relationship? Now, Ricoeur's not denying there's not a relationship here, but what he wants to insist is against what he calls the amalgamation or hybridization, right? Unthinking hybridization or unthinking amalgamation, where we simply slide back and forth or condense one into the other or vice versa. What he wants to insist on in this first shot across the bow here is to sort of warning flag up and say, well, wait a minute, this is all well and good, I'm not denying it. The question is, can we get there from here, right? Can we take this discourse that we could all have? We all have the first-person discourse. You could all write a little piece of paper. I could ask you, what do you experience now? Tell me about how your life works in this situation. You could write it down. We could all do that without any kind of study. Right? We could just do it as human beings. We could write an account of how things stand with you right now. Right? We all can't do this. Jean-Jacques is a brilliant guy. We all can't do the biochemistry. I can't do it very well, right? Some can do it better than I. Right? The question is what he would account, or the person behind the camera, or the person behind a glass wall, if we had one here, right? The person behind a mirror, is what they're observing and their understanding of what's going on. How is it related to the people in the room's understanding and going on? It's a flag he throws up, right? I think I got that here. Because there are other stances we could take. Let me put it this way. This is in my writing, so bear with me. I wrote this down at lunch. In other words, the problem for the neuroscientist who accepts the limit that Jean-Jacques does, the limits about we talked before, only taking the simplest model and only allowing one's explanations biochemical realities, right? So for a scientist who accepts those limitations, which are legitimate limitations, the problem for that scientist is how does the brain adapt truthfully, realistically to the external world? Right? How does that work? That's Jean-Jacques' question. Right? The problem for the lived subject, the I, is how to respond to the set of responsibility and relationships that confront me. Two sets of issues, right? Two legitimate sets of issues, right? The question is, how do those connect? Because it's the same subject, me, right? could take both of those perspectives, right? You could ask, how am I responding to the stimuli, unconsciously to the stimuli that are going around me? How am I responding? That can be investigated, right? And I can set certain regulations about that. We're going to limit our investigation to things that can be observed. Nowadays, with our advances in science, they could be brain images, they can be biochemical studies, all kinds of techniques, right, that we learn as we get more sophisticated scientifically, right? So the rules of the game change in science, right? What are the best ways of mapping that relationship, right? That's a problem, legitimate problem. The other problem is, how do I get through this, right? You know, when I'm tired and I need a little more coffee and that sort of thing, how do I get through this? How do I do responsibly? How do I respond responsibly to what Brian asked and what you were expecting, right? A different set of problems, right? And how we evaluate those processes going well differ, right? But they're also related, right? Because if I don't have some of these biochemical processes going on, if I fail, right, if I have a blood sugar problem or something, that's going to affect the other one, right? So they're related, obviously, but it's not clear how, right? It's not as clear as we might want to think it is, how those things relate. And what Ricoeur asks is, would we have to come up with a third language? Is it possible, this is his question, is it possible to come up with a third discourse which would then unite those discourses? Ricoeur's somewhat skeptical, but he says it's possible. I mean, we don't know. It'd be a matter of fact. It'd be a matter if you can or not. But the question is, here's one discourse. The other discourse is the fancy word used is phenomenological. We'll talk about that if you like. But there are other kinds of hermeneutical, there are other kinds of discourses about ourselves, right? Testimonial, right, etc. How do we write these two discourses, and does it require a third discourse? And is it possible to have such a discourse? Or do we shuffle back and forth? That's an open-ended question. But Ricoeur's assistance against Changeau thinks there is a single discourse. He's very hopeful for this, right? And that a real scientist ought to come up with it. And that society will benefit, and the only reasonable way for society to go is to come up with a single discourse, right? Ricoeur says that's a great, he shares that hope. We want to communicate one with another, right? But before we jump the hurdle and get to that third discourse, that single discourse, I want to assert the difference between the discourses so it doesn't get lost. So we recognize the difficulty is a negative word, the complexity of the question. You can't come up with a solution to a problem unless you articulate the situation accurately. And Ricoeur's worry, so much of this text, is that the situation is not being described accurately enough, right? So therefore the solutions to the problem are insufficient because they cover over problems that ought to be recognized before. And he says, it's not, Chandra says, you're being negative, right? He goes, no, I'm not being negative. I want to do the job right. I want to get it right, you know? And you can't get it right if you paper over or don't pay attention to these critical problems, right? A taste of what's going on. So what I want to do, two more examples, I won't be quite as long with these, where we see this question arising in different forms. So maybe it'll help us to get this figured out. First one is memory. There are a lot in the book, there's a lot of different examples. I picked memory and morality, because I think they represent real problematic questions here. So, start with Changeau again, memory. You may know this. He cites James, which both he and Ricoeur and William James admire. But there's the classical distinction between short-term or working memory and long-term memory, right? Changeau says the following, quote, the neurosciences provide a definite basis for asserting a connection between the memorized cognitive representation, the knowledge trace, certain neuronal activity, and the emotional trace associated with this knowledge. This is where he's more complex than some thinkers, right? He says there are different combinations of traces here. There's emotional factors, there are sort of just sheer representational factors that come together in a kind of state of memory, right? So it's pretty complex. You know it's complex, right? Which appears to be located at the level of the various pathways that unite the frontal cortex with the limbic system, and most especially with the specialized nucleus, the amygdala. The neuronal inscription of memory traces is thus clear. Much nevertheless remains to be done in order to decipher these synaptic hieroglyphs. So we can follow this, and this is where cognitive science is really good here in terms of what it does, and so far being able to trace, looking at cards and memorizing cards and different memory tests, what goes on in the brain, they know where it happens, they know a lot of stuff about this, and they can test whether you successfully remember certain things. Fair enough, and of course that's fair enough. But he asks the following question: are we being faithful enough to the variety of memory, right? For example, what cognitive science does really well is really based on this notion of being able to remember specific kinds of numbers, colors, facts, right, to bring them back into memory. So I forgot your name, now I remember. That's a problem. I have bad with names. We're interested in the fact that why can't I recall, right? The notion of recall is really successful. There's a lot of really successful research into recall. How do we take something that's forgotten and bring it back to presence, right? And we do that by following traces. The word that gets used a lot is trace, right? There are certain things that are going on in the brain that are related to things that went on in the brain, and we can have, well, what inhibits those traces? People with memory problems, etc. We can figure out what blocks the ability to recall and to make these connections, right? So it's a very connective account. Something in the past in the brain has to be connected with something else, and various biochemical things can happen which make that connectivity fail. And there's some things you can do that make it work better, right? One of the things that Schoenfeld worked on for a long time, in between his early studies and his later studies, was on nicotine, right? And he was very much interested, that was a connection he made, right? That nicotine, we know, is a neurotransmitter which helps memory, right? And so the notion is there are things that can, things that get in the way, and things that help memory to happen, and we can test the better and worse, right? So I can give you a test on your memory, you memorize 10 names, and then I can take it away for a while. I can give you various chemicals or various situational aids that will make it easier for you to recall that, or make it more difficult for you to recall that. And we can measure that very clearly, right? You got 9 out of 10 when I did this, or whatever it may be, right? These are things that can be very well investigated. Ricoeur has no problem with that. But he asked the following question. Again, does this discourse cover all of the things that we talk about when we talk about memory? And I'll ask some fundamental issues here. So this is what I find is very interesting. Let's see. He wrote a huge book, end of his life. I review like 800 pages on memory and history. So let's see. Here we go. The notion of a biological trace is attempting to get at the unique nature of memory in a certain kind of language. So we talk about recall of the trace and how the trace. If we talk about recall, the trace has a certain function, right? It's like a memory trick. Right? So the trace here has something to do with a way of jumping the gap between what you want to know now and what you know. So trace has a certain meaning in this recall metaphor, right? Traces have to do with clues that help you to get back to where you want to go, right? So the word trace is being used in a very specific way in this kind of thinking, this way of thinking. Fair enough, right? It is clearer in terms of catastrophe and failed memory. And failed memory. So it works really well with pathological conditions, right? This is really helpful when I can't grasp something, can't remember something. The failure stimulates this kind of, I want to recall. I can't recall. I can't remember. I don't remember that fact or that thing. It works really well when we have these problems of recall. This kind of way of looking at it, it's lost somewhere in the cupboard. I've got to find it. Are there ways for me to find it in my notes? Or I can, for example, if I can't find a file, in Mac, for example, Searchlight looks really well. I type the name up there, and it's one of the big good features of the system is that all the files are all cataloged, pre-cataloged. I'm done. All right, et cetera, et cetera. This is important. Let's do this one. Let's just stop with this one, actually. Let's go through this one carefully, and we'll stop. Okay. However, it is less clear how it fully explains felicitous memory, successful memory. What does it mean to be faithful in memory, right? Is full remembering the complete absence of the trace, or the effacement of the trace. Right? So I had the clues, I get rid of the clue, I get the full thing, and I have a picture, I get the full thing in front of me, the picture goes away, right? So the trace is like an imprint, or a kind of clue to the memory, and once the person really, I have a picture at the airport, looking for somebody, you show up, okay, get rid of that, I don't need that, the person's here, I remembered it accurately, we're done, right? So is that what remembering is? This erasing of the trace in terms of the full presence? Right? A sort of absolute reactualization. Here we find for Ricoeur the general problem of representation with its complicated understanding of distance and presence, past and present. Do we say that the current neuronal activity is true or adequate? So something's always happening in your brain, right? When you try to remember something, something's happening, right? Do we say it's true if it is fully present, and in some sense the same as the original? So something's going on in my brain. How do we make this equation between now I do remember what's going on in my brain now, what was going on before? Is it a kind of gradual? I think it's coming in the distance, right? It's coming closer to the reaches of your brain, and then it's fully present. Now your brain is now in the state that you want it to be in, and now it's fully present. But that's still a trace, right? Or is the idea to get rid of the trace, get rid of these sort of memory tools, and to have full memorization, full recall, right? Do we say the current neuronal activity is true or adequate? We said that. Then, in what sense is it a memory? So I remember something, right? In what sense is it still a memory as opposed to the fact itself, the thing itself? Why do we call it a memory, right? Because to remember would therefore be to get rid of memory. You wouldn't need memory anymore if you had it in front of you, right? You don't need them to be remembered anymore. All right. So then, and now a completely different experience. So here's a quote. A trace must therefore be conceived at once as a present effect and as a sign of its absent cause. Now in the trace there is no otherness, no absence. Everything is positivity and presence. It is here that phenomenology offers not a substitute but a complement. Don't we have the actual experience of recognizing a memory sought and found? A paradoxical sense that the absent is present despite its distance in the past. In short, a sense of the depth of time. Manifested in this instant is the specifically intentionality of memory, which Aristotle describes as the memory of time. Right? Because when memory of fact, time disappears, right? What's 2 plus 2? 4. Well, there's no pastness to that. 4 is 4, right? 4 was the right answer before. It's the right answer now. I don't think about it as it happened in the past. I thought of 2 plus 2. It happens again, right? It simply re-happens. But memory seems to have with this notion of it being in the past, this depth. In the present, I'm thinking of the past at the same time, right? Otherwise, it's not a memory. It's a new experience. I'm having the same experience all over again, right? So, memory keeps the phenomenal and no longer the material trace of this initial passivity, an experienced trace of attention, of being affected by the event. The expression of this initial passivity at the level of declarative memory is therefore akin to a sort of testimony in the very everyday sense of the term given the court explained in the archives. Right? Challenges that, but Ricoeur says, don't we have multiple notions of trace? Right? Here's my example. We'll stop with that. We can do more out if you want to talk about it later. Similar problems. Here's the problem. What if somebody has died, and your task is to remember them at a funeral? You've been given the task of remembering them. Tough task. What does it mean to do that well? Well, it can't mean to remember them in the sense of representing them. It can't be that I'm going to give that. You've heard these sort of eulogies, right? Where somebody does it well or badly. It's not so much that they give an accurate, even holographic. It wouldn't be good if I showed up to here. Here's a clone, or a perfect holograph, or a perfect robotic recreation of it, right? Would that be remembering well? Would resurrection even be remembering well? You may want it, but it wouldn't be remembering. If I resurrected them, had the power, and brought them back to life, that would be a kind of salvation of sorts. It wouldn't be remembering. It wouldn't be remembering. You remember, so therefore, what is my task? If it's not recall, well, we know good and bad ones, right? We know people who remember faithfully. That's what he calls testimony. That's about courtrooms, right? We know people who remember faithfully, and those who remember not faithfully. Those who do it well and those who don't do it well. We know this. We remember to articulate it all the time, but we know people who remember well. And part of that is to reconstruct or to construct a presence for that person, which in that presenting includes their absence. Never denies it, fully incorporates it, right? They're not here. I'm going to remember them, right? That can't go away. Whereas in this kind of memory, you want that hole, that emptiness to go away. You want to fill it. What's 2 plus 2? 4. What's their name? John. Right? You want to get rid of the trace so the full memory can step in and be represented absolutely, right? Without loss. And therefore, any loss of recall is a sickness, a pathology, a weakness, something to be overcome. But there's recall in the recall metaphor, right? Story. With a wedding. Some of us were there. A wedding of 2 students of mine, and my colleagues were there. The wedding was near my hometown, which I hadn't been to. I grew up there. Hadn't been there in 30 years. Right? I'm not that old. 25 years. I was just interested. For some reason, recently I've been having thoughts, talked to some people I knew about where I lived and how the topology was. And I had some dreams of driving around there. And I was just curious to see how they matched up, how much my recall matched up with the facts. So I was curious. So I went there, and some were good. There were some check marks. That was pretty accurate with that picture. Some were not so good. I don't remember that being there, right? And so the idea was that sort of I tested my memory against how accurate it was to the reality, right? And so any loss of that recall was a failure. I didn't worry too much about it, but there was a failure. I mean, I didn't remember that well, right? That completion is not what's operating in remembering a past event like remembering Civil War veterans, World War II, remembering a person who died, remembering these are not remembering the Holocaust, right? That's not what we're talking about. So the question here is this not but we have rules for it, right? We have rules for that, and we have good remembering, bad remembering, and the question is, it's a different discourse. So here's the final thought is, we have a problem laid out before us. How does this remembering, which is obviously related to it, but has a different set of logical functions, has a different structure, how does that relate to the kind of remembering at a funeral, right? Now obviously if you don't have this, you can't do the other one, right? But is this the only set of criteria that we want to hold the other kind of remembering to? Or do we get a kind of fetishizing of accuracy? And often some of the great rememberings are not that accurate in terms of every little detail. But some of the great eulogizers don't get every one of those things right? But they do something else well. They're faithful in some other way. So this is the book's all about, is this notion of multiple discourses and the task of investigating how these discourses interact. And what Ricoeur tends to do is to say, I'm not so sure that we're being faithful to the multiplicity of discourses here in our scientific stuff. We can talk about this later on. That's all. Okay.
All right, we'll